As I mentioned in the email, there were a couple of slides that I didn't have time to go through. So, and I think they are actually useful to start the lecture. If you remember, what I was trying to say, I was trying to make you think critically of this very popular way of thinking about the encounter between the Middle East and Europe in the 19th century. The one that became, is very popular, but it's very popular in the West because of the works of Bernard Lewis. And I told you who Bernard Lewis is. I shared with you one of his most interesting articles. I told you don't have to study this for the exam, but this gives you a good background on how he thinks about the Middle East and how this is an influential Orientalist, a very important advisor to many people in Washington, but he's also an influential scholar in his own right, a professor in Princeton until he resigned some 10 years ago, prolific writer. And the interesting thing is that as far as we here in the Middle East, we here in Egypt are concerned, this is also a very popular way of thinking about the encounter. That is, especially among Islamists. I'm writing, or I was going to write an article about Sharia and its implementation in Egypt and the business about the constitution and the Islamist cry of the need to implement Sharia. And at the core of this, in my mind, the core of this call to implement Sharia is really not a concern about law or a concern about the legal system or a concern about justice. It's a concern about identity. The idea being, the Islamists say, we lost our identity. With the encounter with the West in the 19th century, our elites were so callous about who they are, who we are, and they gave in. They gave up, they gave in, and they adopted Western civilization, Western ideas, lock, stock, and barrel, including in such important matters as Sharia, the legal system. So they dropped the legal system that we once had and appropriated from the West the legal system that we now have. And for the past 15 years, I've been doing research on exactly this topic to challenge this viewpoint. I don't think this is what happened in the 19th century. I've been studying Egyptian legal system, the history of the Egyptian legal system using its own records. And I don't see this. I don't see the elites losing faith and saying, oh my God, you know, the West has come with its power, with its glittering lights, and we cannot face it. That was not, in my mind, what had happened. But that's a very popular way. It's a politically charged description of what might have happened in the 19th century. That is the failure of the Egyptian and the Islamic and the Muslim elites, and in fact Muslim societies. The loss of faith in oneself, the loss of self-confidence, the appropriation of Western ideas, whether it is equality, whether it's liberty, whether it's as if. So I don't want to offer an alternative point of view yet. Maybe I'll do this in a couple of weeks when we have had something to chew on, something to know what actually happened before we dispute it first. But this is Bernard Lewis's point of view. And what I wanted to tell you, what I've been trying to say and what I will continue with today is to say that in addition to these ideas of the French Revolution of equality and fraternity and liberty, there was the challenge of imperialism. And that's not something to belittle. And I want to elaborate on this further today. What I was telling you on Monday is I was inviting you to contemplate what it meant for Britain to have an empire, what it meant for Queen Victoria to be the empress of 300 million people halfway across the globe in a subcontinent she had never even visited. What does this tell you about the imperial mindset and how dominating it is? Now, I don't know what you might have studied in school, but when I was in school, when we studied imperialism, or colonialism as it was called, al-istamar, the way we were taught it was that there was these greedy imperialists in London and Paris who were keen on having our raw materials, our countries as open markets for their products. And in a sense, colonialism was reduced to its economic dimensions. But imperialism was much more than this. Imperialism as a political global system was not only about dominating our markets and using our raw materials to be shipped to the factories in Liverpool and Manchester, only to be then imported as finished products. Imperialism was also a way of life, a way of thinking, a very, and it was challenging because of this. Most of these imperialists, and we've seen some of them, I've told you about Cecil Rhodes, this arch-imperialist who had the idea of establishing a society that would establish British hegemony throughout the world, and he would say so. And in a sense, it was the thought that it was his destiny, the so-called white man's burden, that it is because Europeans are by nature more superior than Indians or Africans or Muslims or Middle Easterners or Egyptians, they had a duty to help them rule their countries, had a duty to educate them, to civilize them. And what I want you to think about is that this was not simply a ploy. This was not something to hide behind. This was not simply a pretext for the economy, for European economies to dominate these markets. There was something of substance in these claims. They actually sincerely believed this.
Based on what are you saying that they actually believe this? Like, are there sources that show that they are sincere?
Their writings, mostly. Their writings. And I'll share with you one such writing by Rhodes and by Lord Cromer later on. I just wanted to share with you, this is, even at this time, Rhodes was thought of as an overtowering figure. I don't know whether you see the pun in this title, the Colossus of Rhodes. Do you see the pun here? Where is it? Can you? Not really. It's close, but. No, it's.
Aren't there a lot of places called Rhodes?
There is a place called Rhodes, which is. It's in ancient Greece, which had a colossus, which used to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And this is an artist's imagination of what this Colossus of Rhodes. It was a huge statue that was one of the wonders of the ancient world, with the hanging gardens of Babylon and the pyramids and I don't know what else. And this is how it was imagined. It was a huge colossus. It's a huge statue governing the gates or the harbor to Rhodes, which is an island to the northwest of Greece, in the northwest of Greece. So that is one of the wonders of the ancient world. And in Cecil Rhodes' time, they dubbed this. They said that he is a colossal figure. He's huge with his ambition, with his imperial oversight. And they imagined him to have a colossus like this over the entire continent of Africa. Of course, this was never built. But that's the idea of British imperialism, with one foot in the Cape and the other foot in Cairo. Because the entire eastern half of the entire continent of Africa had fallen under British sovereignty by the 1880s, by the mid-1880s. So it's a huge, it's something new about Europe. It's not the same old Europe that the Middle Easterners, the Ottomans, the Muslims had encountered, let's say, under the Crusades. This is not a good old-fashioned clash of civilizations. This is what I'm trying to say. This is something new. This is imperialism, not clash of civilizations. And I want to share with you, in answer to your question, Afef, in answer to your question, a quote by Lord Cromer. Now, Lord Cromer, as we will see, was the effective ruler of Egypt for the first quarter of a century of British colonialism, from 1883 to 1907. Technically, he was only a consul, like an ambassador, but practically, because the British army was occupying Egypt, he was the effective ruler of the country. In addition to this, in addition to his position as such, he was the arch-imperialist. He was one of the most sophisticated theoreticians of high imperialism. His copious writings, his letters, his speeches, the reports he would write every year to the House of Parliament justifying his presence in Egypt, and a very important book that he published called Modern Egypt, a 2-volume study on supposedly everything that the British, had managed to accomplish in Egypt. It's a manifesto for imperialism. It's an amazing document. It's a good study on Egypt as such, from his perspective also, obviously. But in addition, it is very revealing about the imperial mindset. You can find it in the library here. It was never translated to Arabic for some obscure reason. It should be translated because it's very revealing of an imperial mindset. And this is what he says, among many other things. This is an article that he published in a journal called the Edinburgh Review in 1908, immediately after he left Egypt and went back home permanently. And he's presenting what he called the sound but reasonable imperialism. He says blatantly, we need not always inquire too closely what these people, the subject races, this is the title of the article, the rule of the subject races, the government of subject races. We need not always inquire too closely what these people themselves think best in their own interests. Although that is a point which deserves serious consideration, but it is essential that each special issue should be decided mainly with reference to what? By the light of Western knowledge and experience, tempered by local considerations, we conscientiously think is best for the subject races, without any real or supposed advantage which may accrue to England as a nation, or to the special interests represented by one or more influential class of Englishmen. In other words, he's saying, I know there are bankers behind me and businessmen who want business in these colonies, but this is not what we're doing. We should also not be concerned about what these subject people want, that is the Egyptians or the Africans or the Turks. They probably do not know, but we know. Why? It's tempered by the light of Western knowledge and experience. And in the rest of the article, you can find it online. If you Google Cromer, the government of subject races, you'll find this article. It's an amazing document of imperial mindset. We know best because we can think rationally, we can control our passions, we have been trained to govern ourselves and hence govern the rest of the world. But those people, especially those Orientals, especially those Muslims, their minds are as twisted, he says, as their streets. They cannot think straight. And we, because we have managed to temper our own passions, we can do this. And that's why we are there. That's why we're in India. That's why we're in Africa. That's why we're in Egypt. So it's an amazing document. Does this go? You're not convinced?
No, because you can truly believe that they are a better race, but still not do what's best for them. Like, I don't think that when he was doing that, he truly thought, he just thought that his mentality was so good that he was doing something good for them, but it wasn't actually. Like, I don't think.
You're doubting his sincerity?
Yeah.
Well, you can never truly know, but he's not different, and this idea, it goes hand in hand with the idea of this linear evolutionary theory about how we move from barbarianism to savagery to civilization, and that's how races were categorized. They're moving along this one line of evolution, and that the West had reached this level of civilization, whereas Africans and Arabs hadn't. And those are theories that are very dominant in the 19th century. So I feel like it's just become inherent in most of these thinkers, and I really think that they believed it, or else they wouldn't have gone out.
I mean, that could be. I'm not doubting that, but I think that I'm sure they saw something great in Egypt to be in Egypt. So they're not just doing that for the well-being of the people. Like, they wouldn't have been there if it was like, it's the same thing nowadays in Africa. No one gives anything about Africa because there isn't much to give about in Africa. But you find people going to, I don't know, like investors going to Dubai and going to where else because there is something to offer them.
I think if you look at it...
Can I get your names? I'm sorry.
Muhammad.
Muhammad.
Yeah, I think what was happening back then is quite similar to what's happening nowadays when especially the US goes and say, okay, we're going to Iraq to overthrow Saddam's regime because they're not democratic. We are democratic, we know better, we want to achieve what we have. It was happening in the same context. Instead of using the word democracy, they used to perceive themselves as civilized, but all the colonies are not civilized. So
they were going for the petrol.
Yeah, but still,
that was very clear.
But still, no, it's not clear they're going for petrol because there's not much that they know about it. But the thing is, they went over there saying that we're there to spread democracy. It's the same thing that the Brits were doing back then, because they were the superpower, then now the US is the superpower. What exactly is their intention? It's not purely they're going there for this sole reason of achieving prosperity in this country. Of course, there's like a hidden agenda, and they're getting interests for the country because colonizing or attacking a country is not really cheap. It's very expensive. So they need to benefit from it. But this is the title that they go.
I think this is an important point as well. This 2-volume thing that he wrote, Modern Egypt, this is not written for Egyptians. It's written for people back home. It's mostly written for the British Parliament. Because it's the British Parliament that, in a sense, pays him and pays for the army of occupation. I'll get to you in a minute. And he's trying to say to them, I understand that you want us to leave, believe me or not, believe it or not. There was a growing popular opinion against the occupation of Egypt in England at that time. It was a liberal government, Gladstone, that was against imperialism, or at least against imperialist expansion, that ended up occupying Egypt. And he's trying to tell them exactly what Muhammad is saying. The occupation costs, not only morally, it costs money. And he's trying to say, on the long run, I understand you're paying for it, that is the British taxpayer, but on the long run, this is good for us. It's good for us because it's good for the economy, but mostly it's good for civilization, for Christian values. It's not Christian values in terms of proselytizing and converting people to Christianity, but improving the moral well-being of Egyptians. I have a couple of more points to say, but first.
But to add on to like the Iraq incident, so for the British to enter Iraq, Tony Blair went to the parliament and said, oh, they have nuclear weapons, we have to go there. And then they found out that they don't. So that is, I think, what she was saying, you know, what makes us question the sincerity, because they were falling under the umbrella of, oh, we want to spread democracy, but there was also the issue of oil, and there was also the issue of, oh, we don't want terrorists in our...
Let me be clear. Let me be clear. I'm sorry, I didn't turn off my... I am not at all saying that there were no hidden values. Obviously, that dimension, probably I should have started with it. The economy is key. But I'm trying to say that it's more complex than that. One wishes that imperialism was only limited to that economic field. It's much more insidious than that. And that we have to take these people seriously. They actually did believe. I know that Bush the second believed that he was doing a good thing in Iraq. Sincerely. That's my reading of his character. I know that there were businesses and oil companies and the Pentagon, and I understand this. But I think there was a moral dimension, as flawed as it is. And I'll give you an example of a serious flaw. This guy, in his book, Modern Egypt, basically said that one of the main reasons why Britain is in Egypt is to help Egyptian women. Why? Because of Islam. Islam is a misogynist religion. It dominates women, and there's no way out for these women. There has to be an outside force. He's not saying it as bluntly as I am now, but something to that effect. Something very similar to what Laura Bush said about Afghani women. That we are there in Afghanistan to help them. Now, it's very easy to dismiss this. And maybe we should, but I think we should keep some part of it, because some people actually believed in this, including this guy. Now, the flaw comes in the following. That this same man, when he finished his tenure in Egypt, he went back to England and became the honorary head of the anti-suffragist movement in England. What's the anti-suffragist movement?
Like the suffragettes, right? They were for women's rights.
Yeah. He became the honorary head of a movement, of a society that was against giving the right to vote for women. And that was his official position. So, is there a contradiction? For him, no. He believes that women should be educated, should be respected. But he actually explicitly said, her throne is in the kitchen. She should stay there. And that's his position. Now, this is a very intelligent man. He cannot be dismissed. This is someone who ruled a very important part of the empire for 25 years. He's not a stupid man. He's a very able administrator. And we have to take him seriously. And these contradictions should be highlighted but should be explained. And how can he maintain these two contradictory positions? For him, it's not contradictory. I want women to be liberated, but to stay at home. I mean, they should not be voted in power, and they should not have the right to vote. But that is much better than what Muslim women suffer from. What I'm trying to highlight also is that imperialism, by its very nature, is a very contradictory project. It claims to liberate, but of course it doesn't. It oppresses people by force. And, but in order to be able to understand it, we have to understand its internal contradictions and its complexities. Let me elaborate further by referring to this guy. You remember I mentioned him, and we started Gabarty, or Jabarti, if you want to pronounce him in a non-Egyptian way. Gabarty is the very famous historian, very famous chronicler, who happens to have witnessed the French invasion to Egypt. And he wrote this account, very popular, very incisive account, عجائب الآثار في التراجم والأخبار, a 4-volume account of many things, including the last volume and a half, are nearly day-by-day accounts of what the French were doing in Egypt. As I was trying to say, this is not some mere observer. He's a very intelligent, cultured, well-read, educated man. He did not know Persian, he did not know Turkish, let alone French or English. He knew Arabic and only Arabic. But he had a very sophisticated worldview. His father was an astronomer / astrologer. He dabbled in poetry and in some science. As I told you last time, he happened to visit the French Institute. And if you remember, that visit is very famous, mostly because of Bernard Lewis. In a book that he published called The Muslim Discovery of Europe, Bernard Lewis has an entire chapter written on that encounter between Ghaberti and the French in this institute that they established in Cairo. You remember that the French came with these scientists. He goes to visit them, and I read to you what he had written about his experience there and how baffled he is. Bernard Lewis and many of even our historians, including Gamal ad-Din al-Shayal, whose account I read to you last Monday, a very famous Egyptian historian who published a book on the history of translation in the 19th century in Egypt in 1950. And in that book, he too highlights this particular encounter to say, look, you know, there was no way. Even our most sophisticated mind, Ghaberti, was blinded by the lights of the French when he went to see them in 1798 in this institute. I actually went to the text of Ghaberti to read this particular paragraph closely. And my reading of it is different from that of Ghaberti, of Bernard Lewis and Shayal. Because this is what he's saying. He's actually, he's saying this. He's saying, yes, I went. It's a verbatim quote. Yes, they have these precise astronomical instruments and clocks and maps and books and libraries, and he mentions this. But this description of the Institute fits in the narrative in a rather interesting way. He's actually describing what the French had done to his city. He's describing what the French army of occupation had done to the city. And he's describing how they altered the city and how they transformed many buildings into new functions. Why? Because it's an army of occupation. It might have been accompanied by scientists, but Ghaberti knows very well that a very important part of what the French are doing is power. So I'm not disputing it. I'm saying that it goes hand in hand. So listen to what he says. Listen to the verbs. Listen to the verbs he's using, and I want you to contemplate it. First, he says, before this verbatim quote, it's a section, this account of his visit to the Institute is part of a section which starts with his description of what the French did to the Nilometer. Have you ever been to the Nilometer? In Rhode Island in Manial? It's what measured the height of the flood. And then proceeds to describe the different tactics that they had done to the city. He says the following: they demolished the dwellings opposite the square of so-and-so. They pulled down, listen to the verbs, they pulled down the minarets of so-and-so. They leveled those roads leading to such and such. They cut through parts of the hill of Muqattam. They tore down the wall of Junaina. They built fortifications, towers, and buildings. demolished, pulled down, leveled, cut through, tore down, built fortifications. It's all acts of violence, of physical violence done to his city. He's not commenting on them. He's basically saying this is what they did. It's at the end of this long paragraph in which he's describing one after another of the various acts of violence committed by the French in the city that he describes his visit. Why? Because he says, and one of the things they did is that they transformed residential houses into something else, including the house of Hassan Kashif, one of the Mamluk emirs, who he had just finished building, and no sooner had he finished building it than they came, occupied the country, and took it over and transformed it into an institute for them. And I visited them, and this is what I saw. So the quote I gave you last Monday comes at the very end of a long passage in which he's describing the various transformations undertaken by the French to his city. And in my reading of this, it's as if he's saying to us, the readers, I am not baffled, actually. It's not that I am blinded by what they are doing. I admire them, but I understand very clearly that this is part of the occupation. This is how the occupation intends to be permanent. He's not saying this, these are my words. But in my reading of this text, this is not a helpless third world observer blinded by the glittering lights of Western culture and civilization. This is someone who thinks that he can engage with them. He can understand what they are doing. In fact, he ends up being a member of the divan that they established, the diwan that they established. And he is part and parcel of this, and he understands what's happening. He understands the delicacies of the occupation. He understands it's not only military. It's not only by cannons and an army of occupation and a navy that Egypt was conquered by them.
Just Bernard Lewis is using the same quote to describe how or use it in his argument to describe how the East was lagging behind the West. The same quote.
Yes. His whole argument is that the East was lagging behind, so the language of lag is key, and that even the elites of the East understood this lag, second point. Third, that given this realization, they had to give in. And that, paradoxically, is the same position of Islamists. The Islamists of today blame the 19th century elites for giving up. And my reading of Gabarty and many other members of the elite, and maybe on Monday I'll share with you some of my own scholarship on the history of medicine, just to give you an idea of what it is that I'm doing. I don't see this. I don't see that people in the East, so to speak, or in Egypt, saw this as a lag. I think Islamists see it as a lag. But people in the 19th century, when this encounter supposedly happened, did not see it as such. And that, I think, is interesting. Because if I am correct in my analysis, the question then becomes, when is it that people started realizing that there is a lag? It's not this, it's not then. It's, I think, in my mind, 100 years later. And that's when the whole question becomes couched in one of identity, East versus West. But I'm jumping ahead. I can see that I lost some of you, but I'll try and explain this on Monday.
It seems like a lot of what we call modern Islamic thinkers also encourage this idea, or adopted this idea that the Muslim world was lagging, and that the Muslim world was lagging, and that they hadn't reached this stage of civilization. I understand that Gabarty's the point that Bernard Lewis focuses on is part of a bigger context. But was he also, did he adhere to this as well?
Did he
The idea that, yes, he does realize that it's an occupational power, but that they are in fact, that they have not reached this level of civilization.
Gabarty is a very sophisticated mind. I think after describing this, of course he self-reflects. And he thinks, why did this happen? How did this happen? And he's not saying what Bernard Lewis wants him to say or claims that he said. He's not saying, oh, they are just way ahead of us. That's not what he's saying. He's blaming the Ottomans, one thing. He's blaming the Mamluks, another thing. And he's blaming himself. But not a blame that is about self-deprecation. It's not about him saying our civilization is found wanting. It's something that could be fixed, and it's something that is political rather than cultural. It's not about culture, it's not about identity, it's not about Islam, it's about politics. And that, I think, is what the Islamists do not want to engage with. In my mind, this whole business about the constitution that is being drafted now misses the question. It is couched as a question of identity, rather than a question of justice or politics or power.
Because the people who are putting it are extremists.
I'm trying.
Extremists is bad. It's like the Ahli fans who are extremists are putting the rules for football. And the Zamalek people, the Zamalkawaya, they're going to get screwed as well because we have extremists who want to have them. But can't allow them something like the Muslim Brotherhood who are putting the constitution, who are extremists to do.
But I'm trying to go beyond the word extremists.
Fanatics?
No.
Insane people?
No. I'm trying to say, what is it that makes them extremists? What is it in their mindset that is particularly problematic? In my mind, the main problematic thing is that they actually, despite all the rhetoric, they do not, they couch most of their political engagements in a language of identity. الهوية. We want to go back to our identity. So all of the language about the constitution, they actually don't care about women's rights. They don't care about the poor. They don't care about justice. As much as they care about the image and the belief that this is authentically Islamic. And I wrote an article on last Sunday, in Issue, to say that I don't think they actually know Islamic history. Despite the fact that they base their arguments, their political arguments, supposedly on this.
I have a question. They say Egypt is part of the Middle East, and we're in the Middle East. But as I know it from the map, I'm not very good at geography, but the Middle East is after the bunny. It's after the peace sign from the Mediterranean. It's on the other side. Why is Egypt a part of the Middle East and Libya, who are right beside us? They're Africans, they're not Middle East.
No, but they're not using this language.
No, Africans called Middle Eastern.
Wait, please. We will discuss exactly this question about how arbitrarily the map is drawn in a couple of weeks from today. Because this is important, how the map was drawn and the self-identification of people, whether African, Middle Eastern, and so on. So let's just postpone this because this is important, and let's postpone this until we describe. But let us continue the story. With regards how imperialism as not only reduced to its economic dimension, but also is there somebody with a mobile?
I think it's outside.
Yeah. So let's continue the story both in Egypt and in the Ottoman Empire, the impact of this imperial mindset. Because and let me tell you what it is I'm trying to say so that you are with me. And I think this is something that I also personally believe is part of the moment that we're living in now. What I'll try to do in the rest of today's session is to show you how what the 19th century experienced in Egypt, in Iran, in the Ottoman Empire is this onslaught, but there is a reaction. And the reaction was a sophisticated reaction. On Monday, I'll tell you some of the ideas of the intellectual ideas of these great minds like Tahtawi and Muhammad Abdu. But already on the political sphere, there's a lot that is happening, and there's a beginning of a constitutional movement. There's a beginning of an effort, a sincere effort on the part of people in Egypt as well as in Istanbul and Turkey to limit the power of the ruler, the Sultan or the Khedive, and to transform the Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, into a constitutional monarchy. And in Egypt, as well as in Iran, less so in Turkey, this was aborted again by imperialism. So let us try and explain in some details how this happened. What is the story of a constitutional ideas, and what is the connection between it and imperialism? You remember this, I mean, we can start with the Tanzimat. You remember this moment in 1839 when the Tanzimat was issued, the Gulhana Edict. You're supposed to know them because you're supposed to have read the text, passing it in 1839, giving Ottoman subjects security of life, and abolishing tax farming and reforming conscription. Who knows what tax farming means? It's not that complicated. Let's try and explain it. What's a tax farm?
Isn't it, it's an exchange for military service or something?
It can be,
Yeah,
but
that's called like, I forgot what it's called, iqta or something.
Well,
I'm confused between iqta and...
This is iltizam in Arabic. This is iltizam in Arabic. It's called iltizam. So what's a tax farm?
Just, is it like a sharecropping system?
No.
It was a system that was implemented during the Ottoman Empire where basically government representatives would go to the farmers and take taxes.
And part of that was their salary, yeah.
It's actually exactly not government representatives. It's the following. I mean, the government wants to raise taxes, but it lacks the means to do this. To raise taxes, you either have to have enough power to go and collect the taxes by force, or you have to have a register to know what is it to be taxed in the first place. If you don't have land surveys, if you don't have a proper census, if you don't have a proper army or a police force, how will you collect the taxes? So what the Ottoman government and the Egyptian government had been doing for centuries was to lease out the process of taxing the subjects to someone, to farm it, to give the right to collect taxes to a private individual, so that, you would come to the government and say, okay, I will have the right to collect the taxes on your behalf. You're not an employee of the government. You're a local thug, okay? And you'd say to the government, I'll pay you in advance. Here's the taxes of next year. It's up to me to collect the taxes by whichever means I can deploy in my own province. If I end up making a profit, I'll pocket it. If I end up losing, well, tough luck. So you can imagine the impact of this on the actual peasants. They don't know what the taxes next year will be. They don't know how it will be collected. And most importantly, they probably end up paying taxes to you rather than to the legitimate government. That's what a tax farm is, in a nutshell. I mean, I'm missing out the military side, but in a sense, it's privatizing the process of collecting taxes. And that was abolished in 1839 because it's very inefficient and it's very oppressive as far as the peasants are concerned. So this is part of the reform of the Tanzimat, of the Gulhana Edict in particular, and conscription. Again, there was no clear criteria of who to be conscripted and for how long. So the government, in a sense, is telling itself and its subjects that you have the right to know in advance what we will be doing. And it's the beginning of the limits of the powers of the government. It's not yet constitutional ideas. It's not yet translated in a constitutional document, but it's the beginning of reform of how the Ottoman government manages its own internal affairs. This was reiterated in another document in 1856 called Khat-i Humayun, which means a royal decree. This is, by the way, the Turkish pronunciation of the word khat. So it's a decree, it's an edict. Humayun means imperial. So it's an imperial edict. Basically reiterating, elaborating a bit further on what had been said earlier. And by the 1850s, we now have a critical mass of Ottoman officials, of viziers and pashas and ministers and administrators and provincial governors who believe in this. And the most important of them is Midhat Pasha, this man, we see his picture, whose picture is in front of us, who attempted to, in a sense, write or draft the beginning of a constitution. And for a while, we do have a constitution. It was declared in 1876. There was, for the first time, elections throughout the empire, and a new parliament is called into being, and a moment of enthusiasm in the empire that this idea of constitutionalism is now finding its way in an institutional manner. There's a parliament, there are elections, there's a document, and these delegates are checking the affairs and the conduct of the government. Sadly, it did not last long. Same year, the new Sultan Abdul Hamid II, came to power, suspended the constitution, dissolved the parliament, and reinstituted despotic rule. Those of you who want to see a film, not exactly about this, but about this period, a very good film called Pascali's Island. I don't know whether you've... by Ben Kingsley. Ben Kingsley is the main actor. Ben Kingsley, who made Gandhi, that actor, he made a film called Pascali's Island, and it's about a small island, Greek island, part of the Ottoman Empire, and he's a spy. He's a spy for Sultan Abdul Hamid. He's spying on Europeans living in this island, and it's a very intriguing, it's a very historically accurate film. So if you have a chance, you should see it. Abdul Hamid is concerned about Western encroachment on his empire. He realizes that the British and the French are vying for influence in Egypt. He's aware that they are elsewhere trying to strike roots, especially in Greater Syria and in the Balkans. So one of the things he does is he starts using or overusing the title Caliph, Khalifa. Now this is an old title that previous sultans had used, but he is politically using it because of political significance. Because he now knows that this is a very potent political tool to use to combat his European rivals in the following sense. 1830, Algeria falls to the French. and it was one of his provinces. He loses it to the French. Algeria is predominantly Muslim. He wants to speak above the shoulders of the French to the Algerian subjects that he now loses them. So he, by posing as a Muslim ruler, by posing as a caliph, he is trying to undermine French authority in Algeria. He's trying to, in a sense, claim the loyalty of the Algerians rather than have this loyalty sent to the French in Paris. He's basically saying that you are supposed to be, you're supposed to look up to me. The same applies to the Egyptians. After 1882, Egypt falls to the British by posing as a sultan, as a caliph. He, in a sense, is claiming to be the spiritual leader of Egyptians. And most importantly, the Muslims in India. Now, India had never been part of his empire, but he's trying to use this title to claim subjects under his moral authority. And we'll see how this became very significant in the First World War, how this title of caliph, how the spiritual significance of the institution of the caliphate became embroiled in political fights between, on literally a global scale between the different European powers. So he casts himself increasingly like no previous Ottoman sultan as caliph, as khalifa of the Muslims. And I'm trying to tell you that this was a clever political tactic on his part. And interestingly, he undertakes a huge infrastructural project. He starts building a railway line all the way from Istanbul to Mecca and Medina, mostly passing through Greater Syria and then through the Hijaz and ending with Medina. Ostensibly, this is a project that aims to facilitate the annual pilgrimage. But everybody knew that with railways, you don't only move pilgrims, you move materials and soldiers. You can have soldiers dispatched to the remotest corners of your empire in no time. So this is a huge project costing millions and millions of Turkish liras at that time, with the British and the Germans vying for influence. Who is to finance the project? Because they know that whoever finances it, ends up being German, they will have a say in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire. But he says, this is a way for myself to keep intact the empire. Of course, these are very important provinces for obvious reasons, religious reasons, and this is a way that I can enhance my control over the empire. So he rules through this network of spies. He rules through using the title of caliph. He rules through building something like the Hijaz Railway and continuing a lot of the technical reforms, opening new schools. But all of this is done while suspending the constitution and abolishing the parliament. As a result, resistance to his rule grows, and secret societies are established in various parts of the empire, and eventually he's toppled in 1909 by the so-called Young Turks, a triumvirate, three pashas, these are men who originally were university students, military cadets, getting together in secret societies, calling for reform, calling for constitutionalism, and eventually managing to depose depose him and launch their own revolution called the Young Turk Revolution in 1909, and abolishing the not abolishing the caliphate, but deposing. It's too hot, no? I can see that the air conditioning is not working well today. But bear with me, a couple of more minutes and we'll be done. So this is the situation of the empire at the end of the century. A very ambitious program of reform that touches many aspects: the economy, the military, the administration, taxation, various aspects. The empire is in the midst of European interests that are really spread throughout the world. And what I find most amazing, in fact, is not that this was the sick man of Europe that was dying, the kind of empire that at least I was taught in school. What I find most amazing in the 19th century, as far as the Ottomans are concerned, is the amazing degree of self-confidence that the Ottoman administrators had, and the amazing resilience. And given the odds, really, what I find again most amazing is how long-lasting the empire was. That they survived the most brutal century, the 19th century, of European expansion, European aggression, European imperialism. And one of the most interesting accomplishments is in the field of the military. We'll see next week that a century of military reform that we started with last week with Selim III reforming the Navy actually paid off. Again, another film. One of the Mel Gibson's very first movies, Gallipoli, done 20 years ago, is about this campaign in which the Ottomans performed very, very well militarily in the First World War. Afef, you had your hand?
No.
No? There was a hand there. No.
Isn't that the Battle of Churchill?
Yes. That's the campaign that Churchill disastrously planned.
Yeah.
I'll mention it in details next week. But it seems that a century of military reform by the Ottomans eventually actually paid off in the First World War. They performed rather well. Now, if we turn to Egypt, very briefly, you remember I ended the story of Muhammad Ali with him establishing a dynasty and his sons ruling after him. This is his son who ruled after his grandson, confusingly, because his grandson Abbas was younger than his son. I hope you're not so confused by what I said. Well, it doesn't matter, but this is the guy I want to talk about first, Said, from 1854 to 1863.
I'm just confused. Muhammad Ali had like 3 sons, one of them passed away.
Muhammad Ali had many sons. He had many sons. One, the youngest, Tusun, died very young out of the plague we talked about. There was another son called Ismail who also died very young in Sudan. He was burnt alive in the Sudan. And then Ibrahim is his commander-in-chief, the strong man, the oldest son. Ibrahim died before him, died 1 year before him. Then Muhammad Ali dies in 1849. The oldest in the dynasty was his grandson, Tusun's son. Tusun, the guy who died young, had married, and his wife bore a child, and his name is Abbas. He married, I don't know what is the date of birth of Abbas, I can't remember. Probably 1813 or 1814, Abbas. So Abbas was the oldest grandson and the oldest descendant of the family. So when Muhammad Ali died, they got him as ruler of Egypt. Then he was killed. He was assassinated in Banha, in his palace in Banha in 1854. 1854. So the second in line was the oldest member of the family, who happens to be Muhammad Ali's fifth son, Said. So that is why he became the ruler. Said was educated in France. He spoke French. He's famous to have loved pasta and ate a lot of it. That's why he was a bit plump. Not as astute as his older brother, Ibrahim, or as his father, Muhammad Ali. And he befriended, as is known disastrously in Egypt, this man. He was a close friend of this entrepreneur, engineer, financier, maverick businessman called Ferdinand de Lesseps, who told him, wouldn't it be a good idea if we started this huge project linking the Mediterranean to the Red Seas? And that's the beginning of the Suez Canal idea. Ferdinand de Lesseps told Said, you'll be very famous if you do it. And the result was a disastrous contract between the Egyptian government and a new company that this guy established, called the International Maritime Company for the Suez Canal, whereby Egypt pledged so much in return for so little. It pledged to provide free labor. It pledged to provide fresh water for the millions of, not millions, hundreds of thousands of people working in the project, and giving free land for the project to be done. And as a result, and to cut a long story short, Egypt literally went bankrupt. And in 1876, Egypt declared itself bankrupt. 1876. What does declaring itself bankrupt mean? What does declaring bankruptcy mean?
It's when a country is borrowing money from other countries and then they fail to repay these loans, so they keep getting more loans and then they keep piling up to the extent that no one is willing to give them any more loans and they cannot pay the debts for that.
Exactly. Yeah. Egypt kept on borrowing money at exorbitant interest, and eventually its finances, its revenues were not large enough to pay back the loans. So you declare bankruptcy. You say, I can no longer pay back the interests or the loan. And this is, again, it's a long saga, but one can make a movie, in fact. One can make a wonderful movie, or indeed, if you are interested, you can make a wonderful online timeline telling the story of Egypt, not only the Suez Canal. You can tell the story of modern Egypt using this project. There's so much connected to it. The economy, industry, agriculture, culture as such, and finances. And eventually Egypt falls bankrupt, and that is used as a pretext for the Europeans to establish their, especially Britain, to establish its hegemony over Egypt. I don't want to rush through this because this is a delicate thing, so I will not go into details. But so I will basically stop here. But if you have any questions about this project before we move on next week or next Monday to speak about Warabi and the beginning of constitutional ideas in Egypt. No? Okay, so I'll post the questions for the exam on Monday. We are supposed to, because we are confused. I'm sure I got a couple of emails from some of you because of the lag and the time we lost. We are covering week 4. As far as readings are concerned, we are covering week 4. We're not yet covering week 5. So please come to class on Monday having read readings for week 4. Week 5 we will not manage to do before the exam.